Good morning, and thank you for joining us here at the Center for New American Security for what promises to be a great conversation today. So on September 13th, 2024, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin announced 7 initiatives to improve the quality of life for service members and their families. These initiatives included a healthcare flexible spending account for service members, access to a Wi-Fi pilot, specifically targeting junior enlisted service members in on-post housing, making moves easier, further expanding the My Career Advancement Account financial assistance to National Guard and Reserve service members on Title X orders, investments in the child care workforce, a uniform cost review, and a quality of life at remote and isolated installations review looking at risk and protective factors. So, I'm Katherine Kuzminski. I am thrilled to be joined today by not one, but 2 Assistant Secretaries of Defense whose joint efforts will be required to make these initiatives successful. We are joined by the Honorable Ron Keohane, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manpower and Reserve Affairs, and the Honorable Brendan Owens, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy, Installations, and Environment. Before I turn to each of them for some opening remarks, I want to emphasize how these efforts overlap and align with the work we do here at CNAS in our Military Veterans and Society program. My work focuses on the individual service member as the lethal tip of the spear, a weapon system all their own, and the comparative advantage they provide in the U.S. military. Other militaries can seek to replicate our platforms and can even attempt to mimic our training. But the quality of the U.S. service member is one fact that can't be replicated. Moreover, while I have colleagues who spend their time and energy focusing on the role of technology and platforms in the future fight, as technology advances on both sides of a conflict, there's a certain degree of stalemate that can occur. Think of the current use of drones in the Russia and Ukraine conflict, for example. As technology advances on both sides of a conflict, the decisive advantage returns to the basic weapon system in the military, the service member. As we look to future operating concepts for large-scale combat operations, particularly a scenario in the Indo-Pacific, we also see a shift in the types of service members we are going to need to recruit and increasingly to retain. If we think, for example, of the operational concept that the Marine Corps is embarking on, the Expeditionary Advanced Basing Operations, they're going to require smaller, more distributed forces in hard-to-reach areas, meaning that the Marine Corps has had to rethink its model from a recruitment-heavy model to a more balanced recruitment and retention model to achieve those senior NCOs that are capable of executing the mission. If the Marine Corps is able to meet their mission, they free up the joint force to meet their mission as well. Each of the services has had to critically rethink the role of the individual service member in their service and the role of their service in the joint fight. As the Department of Defense shifts from counterinsurgency to a large-scale combat operations model in support of the National Defense Strategy. Yet, if we are to view service members as the key element of lethality, and if that isn't just a buzzword, increasingly, we need to take care of those service members and their families that they bring to service. So, with that, I'd like to turn it over first to Assistant Secretary of Defense Ron Keohane, who leads the Manpower and Reserve Affairs.
Great. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, CNAS, for having us here today to talk about and highlight the Secretary's TCOP efforts and all the work that we have going on. First, I'd like to say certainly the administration has taken this as a priority right from the President. Dr. Biden, obviously, as we all know, they had Bo, who served in the military, served in uniform, but all the way down to clearly Secretary of Defense Austin, as well as the Deputy Secretary and on down. So it's been certainly a priority of taking care of our people. I will say, I've been in this job for about 8 months now. It took me about 18 months to get in, which is about a year longer than normal, as we've discussed.
Maybe not.
Yeah, things are changing a little bit, right? Things change. But what I will say is it's my fourth time in the building. Previously, I worked as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Military, Community, and Family Policy, which is one of my deputates now. So I understand the issues. And I will tell you, in the 30, God, I know you're going to say, Ron, you don't look old enough to be in the building on and off for 30 plus years. But it's true. I actually did have hair once. Until I got this job, I think. But we've always heard, and we've worked for great secretaries, right, that have always said people are our priority. And I'm sure they meant it. But I will say wholeheartedly, in the 30-plus years I've been engaged in these issues, this is the first time we've enjoyed the support of a secretary and a president that have absolutely not just directed us to do these things, but given us the authority, the money, and the vision to do that. So while we are overemployed on this, it is certainly well worth the effort. And working with a lot of colleagues across all the different departments and agencies as well has certainly been a great lesson learned. We have done a great number of things over the last 4 years. And I know we're going to get more into that, but I will say a few things. We've done things like increased salary, increase the compensation for our service members. We worked with spouses to try to find them additional employment opportunities and training, find and open up other opportunities to expand childcare opportunities for families, because we understand the financial security element of a family is critically important to us. We've done a lot in recruiting and retention. I'm sure we're going to go into a lot more of these data points in more detail, but can't harp enough about the importance of the dialogue that we've had to get to this point. And it has been not just with the Secretary and the conversations he has with real people, service members, and our civilians, but I go out regularly, as does Brandon. We meet with folks all over the world, and this is how we pull together our ideas, hearing how they work, what is not working, which is even more important in many cases, and working with our MSO, VSO population and think tanks to come together with what we need to be doing to move forward and be successful in what we do. It's evolving. It will always be evolving. And our op tempo with our service members is increasing, and it'll continue to increase. So our flexibility and ability to work amongst each other and think outside the box is critically important. So hopefully that comes through. But I will turn it over to Brendan, and I'm sure has more to say as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. And gallows humor is always the best humor in terms of
gets us through the day,
gets us through the day. And I want to thank CNAS for doing this as well, because it does give us an opportunity to both hear what's going on, what kind of questions are out there, but also highlight some of the things that we have been up to. And I guess I want to start back a little bit. I've been in this job 20 months, and in addition to being the EI&E Assistant Secretary, I am also the designated Chief Housing Officer for DOD. And when I was thinking about, when I was being asked about whether or not this was a job that I thought that I could be good at, and whether I could bring any of the expertise that I had been garnering in the built environment for the 25 years that I had been doing it prior to that, that was the thing. That Chief Housing Officer job was one of the things that was particularly interesting, because DOD as an organization is unique in the world, because there are places in our ecosystem where people go to sleep in housing that's on a military installation. They wake up, they go to work in a building that DOD owns. They drop their kids off at DOD schools or in child development centers that are on installations. They go shop at a commissary that's owned by DECA or AAFES that's run by DECA or AAFES, and then they go home, right? So their entire lived existence is in built and natural environments that DOD is responsible for. And I think that there are aspects of the foundational nature of the work that buildings do to enable people to be the best version of themselves that are often overlooked. So when Deputy Secretary Hicks, in about 3 months, 2 months into the job, about 18 months ago, asked us, my team, the EI&E team, to go through and think about what DOD is from a built and natural environment perspective through the lens of people, right? Through the lens of quality of life. It was this moment of everything that I had done before that converging, right? Because I spent the previous couple of years and particularly the previous year before I came into this job, working at the intersection of COVID and buildings, right? So COVID was this moment for us to understand that our infrastructure, our buildings are not geared to be able to deal with airborne transmission in a good way. So she asked us to build a strategy that said, put the people in the middle and work out from there. And what resulted, what came out of that was our Resilient and Healthy Defense Community strategy, which basically looks at that ecosystem of buildings built in natural environment and says, what about this makes it possible for people, our service members, their families, the civilians, the contractors that are coming into these facilities, what makes it possible for them to show up at work the best version of themselves, right? So that is the sort of grounding aspect of everything that our team is doing right now. And obviously there's other pieces of what we're responsible for, but the thing that we have sort of centered our why around is this resilient and healthy defense community strategy, because when we put people in spaces that enable them to sleep well, to have, you know, privacy, to have security, the version of themselves that they bring to work is the best version of the warfighter that we need. And that, when we go back to the things that we kicked off here, that's really what we are trying to do, and that's really what we understand our job to be at this point. And it feeds into all the things that are being done from a personnel and readiness standpoint to be able to say, all right, this is our piece of the puzzle. Ron's piece of the puzzle is a little bit different, but we're looking at the way that those things intersect and support so that the work that he does plus the work that we do actually is synergistic and is a feedback loop to a race to the top. So I'll stop there and we can get into the questions, and thanks again for allowing us to speak at you.
Great. So we'll enter in some questions up here on the stage, but I do want to flag that at the end of this conversation, we'll open up for questions both here in the room and for our online audience. So if you're watching online, please do feel free to submit your questions, and we will make sure to integrate them into the conversation. So first, for the M&RA, so as I noted at the top, these initiatives actually build on a number of other initiatives. So can you talk about how we got here to these recommendations and what some of the efforts have been over the past couple of years?
Absolutely. To build on that, no pun intended, it has been a 4-year plus effort that the administration, the Secretary, has worked on. And that has worked hand in hand with, as Brendan described, other agencies, even more so other departments. We have done a variety of things. For example, we always talk about compensation. Compensation is certainly important. Pay, we talk about it in a total compensation package. So we've looked at it and thought, okay, what more do we need to be doing? We did, in the last 2 years, roughly a 10% increase in salaries. The President has added, in his budget this year, about a 4% increase. So that is historic. We want to make sure that we're adding that to the compensation. We looked at, for example, what is being done on the civilian side and what is being done on the military side, and looked to see if we could incorporate some of those good practices. So we have the DCFSA and the HSFSA coming up in March, actually. So those lessons learned to build upon what would be a benefit to our service members. We have looked at PCSing, benefits that we have made, or I'm sorry, improvements we've made with PCSing over the last 4 years have included everything from providing monies up front for, in particular, our junior members. Those are the ones certainly that have the most trouble. But also adding things like, can we expand from a 14-day window when they're transitioning, moving, PCSing domestically, to 21 days when the policy is done. So that makes a big difference for them with flexibility. If you're moving overseas, we've increased those days as well. Let's say that you are moving from a CONUS location and there's hard to find, like everybody's experiencing, housing. We could extend those windows up to, for example, 60 days in certain instances between domestic and international. We looked at how we treat pets. Those are important parts of our family, right? So we've increased some of the benefits for moving your pet. It's now $500 domestically if you're moving within the United States, and more. I believe it's about $2,000 overseas. We know that with the cost of everything going up with food prices, right? We looked at what is impacting our junior service members in particular, and those with large families. So we have included, or it developed over the years, the basic need allowance. So right now, if you are, in particular, a junior member with a large family, we make sure that you are at a minimum of 150% of the federal policy, federal poverty guidelines, and the president has increased that in his budget to 200%. So there's a lot of things that we continue to build upon.
Yeah, I think it's one of those interesting areas where military personnel compensation and benefits, where DOD will have a budget and then Congress might increase it, which is a rare thing that we see happening. But there is quite a bit of congressional support as well.
It is. We've been very fortunate, and I want to always be clear about that. We have a great relationship with the Hill. Congress has given us a variety of authorizations, whether it's with hiring authorities to working with us on how to get more compensation across the board to our service members. So we've been very fortunate.
So I'll turn to Assistant Secretary Owens and then turn it back to you. Can you talk a bit about the process, right? We like to kind of see behind the curtain. How did this come to be? How did these initiatives come to be? And what kind of support have you gotten in the building?
Yeah, well, I mean, I mentioned the top down, right? The Deputy Secretary and the Secretary taking these issues seriously is the clearest demand signal that people in our jobs get, and I think that is the RHDC is the manifestation of that top down demand signal. But there's also always a bottom up signal as well. Ron and I do get out and talk to service members and talk to their families, engage with them, and generally speaking, specific to the TCOP memo, the reason that our piece of that is Wi-Fi is because every time we go and we visit barracks, one of the questions that I ask our soldiers, our airmen, our Marines, our Guardians, whoever in those barracks is, if you could have 10 more square feet in your barracks room or free Wi-Fi, what would it be? And no one is going to be surprised that a 19-year-old wants free Wi-Fi. And I think that's one piece of the puzzle, is that there's a clear demand signal and a need there. The other thing that I think is important is that as we sort of peeled back what our service members, particularly our enlisted service members living in unaccompanied housing, were doing with their Wi-Fi, they were doing things like accessing mental health services. They were doing things like connecting with their families when they were in remote locations. And from my perspective, and I think that this is certainly something that's supported down in other parts of the building, certainly, that's mission essential requirements, right? So we were able to get our legal teams aligned that was actually a mission essential thing, and that's really kind of the jumping off point for how this is all coming together. So we got a lot more work to do on making sure that we are capable of providing the Wi-Fi services that are necessary to fully support what our service members need, but from an installations and an infrastructure perspective, it's landed with us because we're the people who are capable of creating the enhanced use leases and the deals that are necessary for us to be able to provide this to our service members in as expeditious a way as possible.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I have a colleague in the room that we worked together back at RAND, and we were looking at things that, usually if a person leaves service early, we think about what did they do wrong, but then we looked at, well, what can the Army or what can the services do? And that access to communications was actually a really big deal for 18 and 19-year-olds.
Absolutely, and I would add, one of the things that falls under my purview is the military and family life counselors. I'm sure you're all familiar with that program. One of the great aspects of it, and it's 2,600 people worldwide, so it's a huge program, but it's really built upon anonymity, right? So you can go seek service, get any type of behavioral health counseling, and even for your children. One of the great points that come out of that is we collect just basic data. A second lieutenant is asking questions about marital help or financial help. So we take all that data, and those data points help educate us. This is a perfect example where on suicide prevention, we realized through a lot of great work with the team that as we synthesize the information, having Wi-Fi is why it seems simple to most of us in the civilian world, is really critical to suicide prevention in many ways. So that was a good example of a building block where we worked with our colleagues to provide that, not just physically, but also on the policy side.
Yeah, that is really interesting, and glad to hear that you were hearing from service members directly, as well as getting that top-down guidance. I'll turn it back to Assistant Secretary Owens. So while DoD is taking the lead on these initiatives, it will obviously require a bit of coordination with the other military departments, the Department of the Army, the Department of the Navy, the Department of the Air Force. So can you talk through the coordination process there and how OSD supports what's going on in the military services?
Yeah, thanks. And I think that's an important, I mean, obviously, if you're sitting in this room, you probably know that OSD, it writes policy. We don't actually implement it. The military departments do that. I think one of the things that's great about where we are relative to a lot of these things is that the military departments have themselves taken it upon to pilot test some of these ideas. And one of the things that we've been doing is collecting all of those good ideas, seeing what works where, what doesn't work, why it didn't work, why it did work, pull it together, and then organize and synthesize that process so that the policy that we end up writing is something that's informed by sort of a real-world test case that the military departments have been running. I don't think we have enough yet to say that we have the key that unlocks all of this from a free Wi-Fi perspective and in UH yet. But the fact that they've already stepped out, done this work, recognized it was a need, and have more than just a theoretical experiment that has been run is extraordinarily helpful for us to build on that and iterate on it so that when we do move out in a very concerted way to direct them to do something, because that's what we do, they will be more than capable of responding in a really positive way.
Yeah, no, I'd add on that. One of the things, as we all know, and as Brendan described, no shocker, it's a massive process, right? The Department of Defense is huge, and then you add the services, and it all comes up together. It's a very complicated process with a lot of lawyers and a lot of thinkers and doers. So we need to also make sure that when we're working the process, we're trying to prime the gears as much as we can. So if I know something's coming down the road, for example, I have a regular cadence of meetings with the service MNRAs, so my counterparts. So we'll flag things for them, try to get them to start thinking. They'll do the reverse. So that's been very productive just in a normal day-to-day cadence of a process. But one of the big things that we try to think through is making sure that, for example, if there's a policy going to be going through the Army, even if it's something as simple as we would think for Wi-Fi, which becomes very complicated anyways, that the Army, the Navy, Marine Corps, Space Force, everybody's kind of on the same page, and we're trying to come together with an overarching plan of policy. But it also needs to not just be about the direction that we put in the policies. They need to be ubiquitous enough to encompass everything, but we also need to be able to fund it. It needs to be something that we can do, and this is one of the dialogues we have with the Hill all the time. Certainly they have a cap on our budget, so if they're going to direct us to do something, we want to also be able to have a dialogue with them, an honest dialogue about what the costs would be, how we can do cost savings, and also making sure that we palm for this, so the out years, so that if it is successful, and there is a pilot that's working, that we're able to make this really a program that's going to be helpful, not just a turn the lights on and turn it off thing.
Yeah, it certainly is challenging when Congress makes a requirement but doesn't on the back end fund that
Exactly, doesn't let that top end.
On behalf of my military department counterparts, it's also hard when OSD does it. So
well, that's true. That is
we
true.
resemble that remark a little bit.
That's fair. That's fair.
So for both of you, and I'll start with you, Ron. So the two kind of categories that we see in these initiatives, one is directed at the service member themselves, and the other is more broad and affects their family members as well. And we see this expansion from purely active component initiatives to the National Guard and the reserves. So can you talk us through kind of those two broad categories and what some of the initiatives are that you think will have maximum impact?
Absolutely, and there's a long list of things that we're very proud of and we know are going to make a positive impact. But in the department, we always say that we recruit a service member, we retain a family, and we can't stress that enough, because if the family is not functioning, if they're not healthy, both financially and physically, then they're not going to be able to do their job when they put the uniform on. So we take a look at not just the active component, but also the reserve component. And we do a variety of things. For example, in the military spouse area, we want to make sure that military spouses have not just an opportunity to find jobs and try to connect them with industry, but also do they have the skills. A lot of times, in particular with the junior service member spouses, and anytime I travel, I always do an audience with them, and much to their chagrin, they don't usually know what it is. They're usually called into a room and asked to volunteer. And I just got back from Germany a couple weeks ago, and we had 6 junior military spouses show up, and they had no idea. But those are the best audiences because they can really give you information on what's working and what's not working. But what we find is military spouses are largely more educated than their civilian counterparts, and the moving and the cadence of that move obviously disrupts quite a bit. We see an over 20% unemployment rate amongst military spouses. Sometimes it's as simple as helping us figure out what they want to do. So we have career coaches. Do you even know what you want to do? Do you have a degree? If not, or a certification, what could we be doing to help that along, whether it's a certification, continuing education, credits, or even working with our state liaison office with the individual states for license portability and those types of efforts, which have been extremely helpful. We've seen a small downtick in our unemployment, but certainly it's over 20%, and that's not enough. We also want to incorporate the reserve component. They play a critically important part. So we're really excited that we are able to extend the for Title 32 AGRs, we're going to be able to extend the flexible spending accounts to them. So that's about 48,000. And while that's a big number, it's still a small number in comparison to what we have. But we continue to do things like that on both sides. And I'll also add that we look at our civilian counterparts and the important role that they play. So they're important as well. We need to make sure that we're continuing to look and revisit not just the time to hire, but the process to hire, and what opportunities we're giving them. So it's multi-layered, but we continue to try to make sure that we have a balance between the reserve guard, and then of course the civilians and military spouses as well as the service members themselves and their children.
Yeah, and I think that hits on some good data and research that comes out from our colleagues at Blue Star Families, right?
Absolutely.
So we have the unemployment rate. We also have the underemployment rate among military spouses, and that can lead to a lot of frustration.
And even in on the reserve side, we see an 8%, which is double the national average of unemployment among spouses, and we got to be doing a better job there. So we try to integrate everything.
Yeah, so Assistant Secretary Owens, if you could talk us through, I think it's easy for us to say, why can't we just, install a Wi-Fi box in a barracks and call it good? What are some of the procedural things that you all have to think through in terms of actually establishing access to Wi-Fi in military housing and in the barracks?
So I would start, unfortunately, with the lawyers, right? Because there's a bunch of different ways that a bunch of different hoops that we've had to jump through so far to let the secretary, which is a weird thing as I'm saying it coming out of my mouth, designate Wi-Fi as something that is a mission essential requirement, right? So that was a fair amount of groundwork that we had to do to overcome the legal barriers to ensure that we were doing that, right? So we've got a bunch of legal precedent that we're working our way through. After that, the challenge becomes how do we partner with the installation and the service providers in those areas to make it possible for us to do that, right? Some of our barracks are very well set up to be able to just very easily plug in a router. I mean, that's what's happening right now. They're plugging in a router. They're just paying for it, right? So we need to work out that piece of it, which is not that challenging. There's going to be other places, and one of the things that we're doing is focusing on remote and austere locations where access is more challenging that we know of as a priority right now so that we can get after this. And whether that's a physical transformation of the building or whether it's, some type of retrofit is, all of those things are things that we're going to have to get after to be able to provide these services.
Yeah, and that opens the door for a good conversation on this study that's called for to look at remote locations. And unfortunately, we've seen reporting of an uptick in kind of harmful behaviors, whether that's suicidal ideation or sexual assault on more remote installations and the lack of access to care. So can you talk a bit through what you'll be looking at when it comes to both risk and protective factors in that study?
Sure, absolutely. And we are really excited about seeing what comes out of that study because it is very complicated. We have a number of locations where they are in the middle of nowhere, right? So it provides a number of challenges from a variety of levels. We do believe that some of it's going to have to be policy driven. Do we make exceptions? There are some places where we will have a policy, for example, that might have a 50-mile radius, which is normal in regular CNAS locations. But when we're talking some of these remote locations, that doesn't give you anything at 50 miles. So we're looking at the policies to see how do we redirect some of those qualifications for those specific locations. I was up in Alaska about a month and a half ago at Eielson, and I will tell you one of the challenges is finding staff on the behavioral health side. They have one MFLAC up there, and we're working with the services to try to find more support. And if we can't provide a body, can we provide policies that would allow us to do something more on the telehealth side? In addition to that, have we looked at the other layer of how do our contracts look? We have a lot of support from contractors, and I will tell you one of the things that I looked at in the MFLAC program when I came in was that we had unintended consequences of some of our policies that we had placed into contracts that prohibited that. A lot of great lessons from COVID that allowed us to open the aperture on that, but I will say that we've had to do some tweaking, and that made hopefully a big difference. But there are financial consequences. There are issues, for example, when we're moving out to a far location, we're moving maybe a civilian, and the 2017 tax changes provided additional heavy burdens on PCSing for our civilians as well. One gentleman that I met with got a $90,000 bill to move out to Alaska, which meant that he had about a $30,000 tax bill. So that is an unintended consequence. And yes, it takes 3 or 4 years to cycle through in your deductions to try to make that back. But all to say that it is very complicated. It's multi-layered. It's like peeling back an onion. But we're looking at how we can do a better job, not just physically, but also try to see what remote type of support we could bring in for those isolated locations. And hopefully working with our colleagues in different offices, we'll be able to do things like Wi-Fi that'll make a big difference.
So thinking about the PCS piece in particular, I myself am an Army spouse and definitely have lots of experience with, great and smooth and seamless PCSs and, the more traumatic experiences. And I think a number of folks in the room have similar experiences, and that our colleagues in the military serving organizations and veteran serving organizations know the weight that can bring on it. There was a particularly acute challenge in the summer of 2020 and 2021 when the housing stock went down and rents went up, and for our civilian counterparts who are moving to take a new job, that's a choice, but in the military you are following orders. And so can you talk us through some of these more kind of out-of-the-box things that you all are thinking about when it comes to PCS lightening the load for service members?
Sure, and I'll start. Part of it, again, as I mentioned a little bit in my opening remarks, is about extending the amount of time that we allow them to get to their location, whether it's providing additional days, providing monies up front. Alaska, again, great example. We learned that because of the housing restrictions that they have there and because of their local kind of traditions and the way they do business there, which is probably not that much different than a number of different places, but they have to have a lot of money up front in order to be able to lease the houses. Oil. You buy your oil maybe twice a year. They don't have natural gas up there in most of those homes, so you rely upon the oil, and all of a sudden, as a junior enlisted, you're going to get a $4,000 bill up front. So we're trying to figure out from our side, how can we perhaps provide them the monies up front? And then, of course, when it comes to OCONUS, it's a whole other level of complication, but we're looking at expanding those days that they're able to get those additional resources for temporary housing. We're looking at different ways in order to provide them more monies up front for a variety of different things, but also, as I noted, about pets. How do we get our pets there safely, provide reasonable accommodation for what it costs today to do things like that, big members of the family. So a variety of different things.
Yeah, that's great. So I'll pose one last question here, and then we'll turn it to the audience. And a reminder for those folks online to submit your questions online. I'll be able to take a look at them. So returning to kind of the purpose of my opening remarks is that we view these things not as a soft, nice to have, but actually a critical factor in driving the lethality and the effectiveness of the fighting force. So can you talk a bit to how you see these initiatives actually improving the ability for our fighting force to meet their mission? I'll start with you.
I would start with my chief housing officer hat on. Our version of recruit the member, retain the family is something along the lines of, I've never met a service member who joined because DoD has world-class housing. I have met some who have at least in part left because we don't, right? So that retention issue is something that goes directly to military readiness. If we lose a talented service member and their family because housing standards are not sufficiently high, that is a direct impact. And I think that as we unpack that and as we understand the ripple effects of that throughout the force, it does come back to something that is not in any way, quality of life. It is a fundamental readiness issue that we're talking about. But I'll also sort of tag on to something, from a physical infrastructure perspective, going back to Eielson. If you're going to sleep in a barracks and the blackout curtains don't work for whatever reason, right? You're not going to be able to get the quality of the sleep that you need to show up in the best version of yourself, right? So that manifests in a bunch of different ways. It manifests in self-harm sometimes when you have all of these pressures bearing down on people. And actually the pin that I wear is mental health and suicide prevention, because I want people to ask me what an installations person is doing, thinking about those things, so that I can start to connect dots in people's heads, because it's about blackout curtains, it's about security and lighting, it's about air quality in all these spaces, and that is a fundamental need. Again, directly back to readiness. And one more thing on the readiness front is sort of the amount of money that we spend in healthcare. DoD self-insures, right? So if a lieutenant has a kid who lives their life in military family housing, and the quality of that housing compromises the health of that child, by the time that service member is a colonel, right? All of the physical manifestations, all the health impacts that they've accrued over the time that they've spent potentially in housing that we are responsible for is a bill that's borne by a different part of the organization, and something that is one of those ounce of prevention, pound of cure type of things, right? We can do, if we focused on making sure that we are preventing the manifestation of some of these challenges, we are going to make it through the entire rest of that service member's career. They're disconnected from challenges that they would otherwise drag them down from being able to be the best version of themselves in the mission. So I'll stop there, but I could keep going. If you wanted me to.
When we think about the current recruiting challenges, right? We overly recruit from family members of service members, and so if any kind of health concern is introduced, that actually affects our ability to potentially recruit the children of service members in the future.
Absolutely, and I'll add, one of our bigger areas that we look at is really about, and I mentioned it before, we recruit, a service member, retain a family, and that is a wide berth, right? So we need to make sure that we are providing, and this gives us the tools to do a variety of things, from military spouse employment to also childcare. The president's budget has additional monies in there to kind of rethink how we compensate our child care workers. And that is important because, just like the civilian world, they're having trouble hiring. So we're rethinking it. We're adding different positions. We're also adding different programs that allow folks to provide, not just have access to childcare in the local installation, but if they're at a location where there's few, we've worked with the states, for example, to try to pair up to make sure that our high standards for our childcare is met by the states, and then we can work with them to provide additional opportunities for seats for children. Talked a little bit about the military spouse employment programs. There are fellowships. There are a number of different opportunities for our military spouses, again, not just to get educated or certifications, but also paired up with industry. So all these things, I think, combined really give us a firm grasp on being able to retain families. Retention is strong, and that's one of the great things. As you noted, recruiting is always gone up and down. We have experienced some really good progress in the last couple of years through a lot of hard work from a lot of folks, really trying to rethink how we do it, because we do only recruit or have the success recruiting mostly with the Southern Smile, as we call it, or with military families, and that is somewhat problematic. We need to expand that. We need to keep our foot on the gas. So all these things combined will not just add to our current recruiting issues, but also really retain our service members and make a healthier family for all of us. So.
That's great. Well, I'll turn to our in-person audience for our first question. Mark? Oh, we got a mic coming your way. And I'll ask you to give your name and affiliation.
So my name is Mark Posard. I'm a military sociologist at the Institute for Defense Analysis. Kate and I used to work together. Okay. I hang out with a lot of strategists, even though I study personnel issues, and they'll talk about great power competition with China and Russia. And when I ask about the stuff you do, they're like, well, they'll figure it out. If we got to go to a major war, that's something we don't really cover. Going back to the last question that Kate asked, how do you bridge the strategy component with all this great power issues going on with the personnel stuff, which is really the nitty-gritty on the ground? How do you bridge that gap that can seem to appear sometimes?
And I'll start. It is very complicated. It's not easy. One of the things that we're doing from the direction of the Secretary and others, we're looking at a whole new way in which we look at the force to begin with. Total force optimization. Total force is now, the way we look at it, we also include the civilian population. So as we look at this, there's a number of different bridges that have to be crossed and connected. At the end of the day, our armed forces have to defend our country, defend the homeland, defend whatever the Secretary and the President really directs us to do. And that is very complicated, but that is the number one priority, right? So we have to fit in under that and support it in a number of different ways, however we need to. I truly believe, and I'm sure the Secretary and other leaders do, that what we're doing really enhances that. It gives us other opportunities so that when a service member does have to deploy or is asked to deploy, they know that when they put that uniform on, that their family's taken care of. It's one less thing for them to do. So it isn't simple. If there was a silver bullet, it would have been done. But we are working across multiple fronts, whether it's looking at mobilization to total force optimization and how we're doing that, to even how we're hiring, how we're providing health care, providing behavioral health in particular. Right now, that's obviously a big thing. So all those things combined is really what we're trying to do to bridge. It's almost like a shotgun approach as opposed to a single thread. Hopefully that's helpful.
I would echo everything that's there, but I would also sort of talk about, there's a very deep understanding of the value of resilience on the infrastructure side of all the people who do the basing strategies and the work that actually is the mission of DoD. And what we've been doing is working to expand their understanding of risk in the system, right? So there has been a tremendous amount of work done inside the fence line to make sure that we have energy resilience, right? Microgrids, generation, all sorts of requirements around making sure that we can operate for 2 or 4 or 6 or 90 days, whatever it is, if the civilian power grid goes down, right? But when you pull back and you say, all right, great, the civilian power grid's down, 70% of your workforce lives in that community, how are they getting to work? Those types of moments are things that, look, they make the problem so big that you are almost paralyzed by its complexity, but we do hard stuff for a living. Well, sorry, the people in uniform, we do hard stuff too, but not like the way they do hard stuff. They do hard stuff for a living. They tackle challenges that are that existential, and it's just about us illuminating that and saying, all right, how do we get after this now? So that work, I think, has been going on. It's not like you need to convince somebody that, I think it's a little bit more complicated than saying that where a gunnery sergeant puts her kids to bed is a readiness issue. that's a little bit more of a story that we need to build, but I don't think it's outside the realm of connecting the dots back to say, all right, we get that, and that's going to be something that motivates more focus in these areas.
And I think that's a good opportunity to plug a recent report that our program put out that was looking at what if we had to go to a full mobilization situation again, something akin to what we had to do in World War II, and thinking about what are the things that are within DoD's realm of control, and then how do we pull together more of a full of society approach to think about protecting the electrical grid in civilian communities around military installations. I'll go to an online question. So this is from Brandon Archuleta, who is an adjunct senior fellow with our program and is currently stationed overseas. So as the department prepares to publish the quadrennial review of military compensation early next year, could you share any surprising insights that the QRMC team discovered about the current state of military compensation and benefits?
Wow.
Very specific question
no,
from
but that's good.
a
So
compensation
Brandon,
expert.
Yes. So we'll be seeing a lot of those results coming out. It is a very complex study that's being done. I think I will say at least personally, one of the things that I was interested to read is I think it upholds some of the thought processes that our compensation package is relevant, that it is good. We do have good compensation packages for our service members. There's always things that we could be doing better, and we will continue to do them better. But I will say that I think that, again, is one of the more notable points that came out of it. I think we'll also see other aspects coming out that ultimately go around mobilization and how we do these different activities. The economy is obviously up and down. The various benefits that we're offering up, I think, again, will help for low-income families. So I think we're on the right track. I'm looking forward to having that released in the coming weeks, probably. So we'll leave it there.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, and I do think that it's interesting, back in 2015, as Congress was preparing to change the retirement system to the blended retirement system that we have now for new service members, we here at CNAS did an evaluation of, well, how does the military compensation package compare to other career fields in the civilian sector, and looking at specific locales as well, right? Because thinking about basic housing allowance as part of the compensation package, and actually saw that, compared to civilians who've seen stagnated wages for 30 years, that the military has come a long way. I'll return back to the room right here up front. Yes. And again, your name and affiliation.
Thanks. Konstantin Turobin with military.com. So I wanted to talk a little bit, or ask you guys a little bit about sort of that bottom-up signal you mentioned. So as a journalist, we, or at least I, deal very, very much with the bottom-up portion. And, typically when we write a story about something, completely substandard, the services and the Pentagon is quick to deal with the immediate need, but the longer term fix, the new barracks, the new parking deck, is often, often takes years to sort of manifest itself. Off the top of my head, the George Washington suicides, for example, part of that was sailors had these ridiculously long commutes because of a lack of parking. That was in 2022. It took 2 years to announce the parking deck. The parking deck is projected to be built in 2026. So we're talking about, a 4-year delta. All of this leading up to my question of, obviously I understand, and we've talked about this, lawyers are involved, and this is all a slow-moving process. Is there anything you gentlemen are doing to kind of speed some of these capital improvements along so that, barracks doesn't take 4 or 5 years to manifest itself?
Yeah, I mean, we're yes to all of the above. It just takes time to lay in the money, design, execute the projects, and it's always a competition for resources inside. I do think it helps that the signals are coming that this is the type of thing that we need to get after. So, but I will say that in the shorter term, I maybe have a different perspective than you on quick to respond from a DoD perspective. I think that there are things that we need to do in the shorter term that look at that would be more O&M money, FSRM money. And I think that it's just a question of making sure that we understand where the leverage points are in a better way so that the quality of life improvements are not understood to say, all right, if Wi-Fi is the thing that the service members want, what are we underfunding to be able to provide something that maybe that would be more, I don't know, I guess I think of it more as vegetables than it is, dessert, right? And I think that that's the type of thing where the studies that we're doing now to assess the benefit of doing better on indoor air quality and doing better on acoustics, doing better on lighting, doing better on, just making sure that HVAC systems are running as they need to. Those types of efforts are being used by the MILDEPs to prioritize in the nearer term. That's a shift in the way of thinking. It's coming. I'm very excited. I'm happy to partner with the military departments to be a part of that change in the way that we think. But we're at the sort of making that turn now, and I think it's going to be something that we accelerate towards in the future. But I think that if all of our eggs were in the basket of Milcon, like to your point, those sailors might not be in the Navy anymore by the time that parking issue at Norfolk is fixed.
And I'll just add a couple things. One of the things that we're very fortunate, we have great department secretaries, very devoted staff, and they understand there's the big rocks, right? Those are the hard ones to move Milcon. But for example, down in Norfolk, the military and family life counselors, MFLACs, we surge. So if the commander down there says, hey, we have a suicide problem or we're having issues in this particular area, we can surge help in there to kind of try to bridge that gap. So there's a number of resources that while they're not flashy and they're not the big rocks, we absolutely immediately integrate those, as well as folks that in my department, for example, would look at, okay, are there policy changes that we need to make now that we can make quickly, whether it's through a DOTI or a DTM or something hopefully lesser. So there's always that change going on behind the scenes, but this administration, the secretary is really taking these to heart and tried to find creative ways to bridge the gap. And hearing from the commanders in particular is what's going to do the right thing down there, not us just constantly telling them, but we're moving that ball along.
Go back to the side of the room.
Hi, my name is Debbie Bradbart. I'm at the Boeing Center for Veteran Transition and Military Families at our new campus in Alexandria at Virginia Tech. I had a question. In a week or so, we're going to have a new administration one way or another, and I wondered what you thought some of the priorities for a new administration would be.
Or should be.
Or should be. I mean, I'll say first, yes, you're exactly right. One way or the other, the administration will change. I certainly can't speak for either of those administrations. I will tell you what I hope. I think that through the hard work of a lot of folks, a lot of great military folks, great minds, civilians as well, I think that a lot of the groundwork that Taking Care of People memo has developed over the last 4 years will continue in regards to just overarching support on the family side. In particular, we do, I think, a pretty good job of taking care of our service members. That's a little easier. It's a little more black and white, although I should preface that by saying we need to always do more. But I think the look at how we take care of our families, whether it's an EFP family, EFMP family rather, or childcare, military spouse employment, all those things really do add. And we would certainly encourage, I would certainly encourage, and I'm sure we're probably on the same page with this, that a lot of these issues continue to move forward because it's the right thing.
Yeah, I would maybe start by saying it would be an honor to be asked to return. So that would be a if we do get that opportunity. I think we actually had an offsite last week. Yeah, last week to sort of talk through what the next year looks like. Either way, right? Because yeah, coin flip, I guess. The thing that I think is important about the personnel side of this and from an EI&E perspective and a housing perspective, the shift that we have been pushing towards to put people in the center really is the thing that I think there is broad consensus and bipartisanship around. And I would hope that that would continue irrespective of how that goes, because we do have an obligation to do everything that we can to improve the quality of life and improve the quality of service. And that just goes across everything. And while we have been sort of making the muscle movement to create the momentum that's going to allow us to be able to connect dots that previously have not been connected, I think we're starting to see light bulbs I sit in DMAGs and I watch undersecretaries be like, oh yeah, I didn't think about that before. I don't think those light bulbs get turned off, and I hope that they don't as well. So.
And the only thing I'll add, I'm sorry, is, and we see this with, for example, Representative Bacon, Congressman Bacon, been a great partner and worked on a number of quality of life initiatives that some of them we had already been working. So I think there's enough synergy there that's bipartisan, that shouldn't be political, that's going down the right track. So Congress has been a big supporter. I think there's
plenty in the NDAA last year. Absolutely. In terms of UH, in terms of the Military Family Housing Council that I chair now, that is going to endure. So that'll all be there as well.
Yeah, it is a rare area of bipartisan consensus, both on the Hill and cross administrations that we've seen over time. Certainly the details and the contours might look different. So a question for Assistant Secretary Owens. So with respect to the Wi-Fi service, something that has been a topic of discussion and in the news is, what about folks afloat on carriers in particular who go months without regular comms? That's a complicated question.
And I have to admit, I am not the person to ask. I would love to have an intelligent, thoughtful answer for that, but I'll have to take it for the record and get somebody who
and I think the
has actually
Department
spent
of the
time
Navy is
afloat, right? Yeah.
Thinking that through. Okay, so an additional issue of retention. So female service members are much more likely to be married to another service member than their male counterparts, and so access to childcare, if you have two service members at the same time, might look like very non-traditional hours, and that isn't something that's always available on every military installation. Certainly in the Navy, there's an accounting for the fact that people stand night watch, but maybe at an Army installation, the CDC doesn't open until 7 a.m., but PT for both parents is at 5 a.m. How do you think through that? So any thoughts on the direction of expanding the availability of childcare through the non-traditional hours?
Yes, the short answer is absolutely. And I think if we look back pre-COVID, there were a number of more opportunities for supporting service members and their families that were in that type of a situation. So in addition to trying to open up the aperture, so I'll start by, clearly there's not enough child care workers out there for any of us. But we're always looking at ways in which we could expand that footprint. So working, again, with the local, state, and local authorities, military families, getting them licensed to our standard to open up opportunities for whether it's in-home care, providing additional fee assistance to families to be able to afford the additional costs that come along with that. Not every location has that luxury. I will add the National Guard has started to look at something that's near and dear to my heart, which we're trying to get the services to look more at, which is backup care, emergency backup care. So if you're a member of the Guard and Reserve, for example, you're supposed to go drill on Thursday night, you're supposed to leave, and your mother-in-law is going to watch the kids, get sick, what are you going to do? Real readiness impact if you have to change that. So there are organizations, and this goes as simple as looking out to what the civilian world does. They go to these organizations and they buy up hours of care in brick and mortar or sometimes in-house care. So we're looking at all those things to open up the aperture, trying to encourage more folks to be caregivers as well is something that we're looking at. But short answer is yes.
All right, well, with that, we are coming to a close. It's a real privilege to have both of you here today. I think it's rare that we get two assistant secretaries at the same time, but I do think that it takes the consideration of how we manage the people and the infrastructure to actually execute on these good ideas that come out of the department. So with that, thank you so much. And for folks online, feel free to check out the SecDef's initiatives, which are up on the DoD website as well.